Welcome to the Drawing Board. I'm your host and in-house artist, Erin Leffler. If you're not familiar with the Drawing Board, here's a quick recap of what happens on the show. Every episode of the Drawing Board, I invite a guest from the comics and entertainment industry, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what they do. And while we're learning about what they do, I'm also drawing them. Pretty fun, right? Well, my guest this week I'm really excited to have. It's another musical guest, everyone. He is a guitarist and composer. Please welcome my guest, Ken Navarro. Hi, Ken.
Hey, Erin. Thanks for having me on. This is nice.
Thanks for coming on.
Sure.
So, for kids who may not know, because, guitarist is pretty simple, but composer can be a little bit more tricky to understand. How would you describe what you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I write music primarily for myself, although I've been commissioned to write for other people and you know, depending on the situation, but primarily it's for myself. I have 25 albums and they're almost all music that I've composed. And typically composer, you know, you kind of think of that word, I think, especially when I was younger, I would have thought that meant classical music. And I have written for orchestras and that sort of thing as well, but I primarily write for what would be called contemporary jazz. So it's, you know, that's what composer means to me anyway. It's a broad term, but the writing of the music itself is what I consider kind of more important than the fact that I'm a guitarist. I think people buy my music because they like my guitar playing and they like my songs. But for me, I think of the composing as the real core of what I do.
That is super cool. Now, I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I saw you play when I was a kid. So that was quite a little while ago. Yeah. So you've been doing it for some time. How long have you been doing this?
Well, I started as a professional musician pretty much. I played all kinds of gigs growing up in high school, you know, through junior high and high school. And, you know, so I've been making money at it for a while. And I taught a lot when I was growing up too. But I guess I officially became a professional musician when I graduated from college when I was 21 years old. And that's all I've ever done once I graduated from college. I got a degree in music. And I guess you could say I've used that degree, but not directly. You know, I'm primarily self-taught at just about everything that I do, and I'm happy to learn about it. And I'm a lifelong learner at things. You know, I think that's a really important way to be, as especially as we age. It's what keeps you young. You know, my college degree was in music, but because they didn't know what to do with a guitar player back when I was in school, the music schools just didn't exist for guitars. They really existed for violins and French horns and all that. They made me a voice major because I'd always sung. So I went and got my degree, in voice, but I really never looked back and sang again. I was always primarily interested in the guitar.
That actually ties into something I love getting to ask, whether I have a graphic artist or a musician on here. A lot of the times we get asked what type of schooling we did. And I find that such an important thing to talk about because it differs for everyone.
Yep.
Do you feel like that's an important thing, that you have to take schooling if you want to get into this career? Or is it something that if you have the talent, you can even do it?
I don't think you have to have advanced schooling. And by advanced, I mean anything from college and beyond. If you want to teach music, if that's what your love is, then you kind of have to, especially as you go up to higher levels of education. I don't always agree with that. I've actually had colleges come to me and say, we would like you to teach, but we need you to go get this doctorate degree. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I already know more than most of those people who would be teaching the classes because I've been doing it for all these years. And they are still, you know, in that system where they need you to have a degree. So I guess it just depends. For me, what I ended up doing, I among the many elective courses I took in college were some business courses. And, you know, those courses have turned out to be more important to me in some ways than some of the music courses I took. So, because when you're a self-employed musician, well, when you're self-employed anything, you are an entrepreneur. And if you're not taking responsibility for the business side of what you are doing, you're actually only doing half the job very well. So I remember taking courses, a very basic accounting course, which I'm sure I was having trouble keeping my eyes open for. But many years later, when I started my own record label and I was setting up my accounting programs, I had that textbook right on my desk for a few weeks because it was really helpful to figure out how to begin to properly keep records for my new company.
Yeah, that's really, really good because that's something that I always found is definitely helpful as well.
Hmm.
And I actually was the same way where I did a little bit of schooling, but after a little bit, I was like, I'm done. So it differs really for everyone. I
It
love
really
getting
does. Yeah.
different stories.
Yep.
For you, you've had such a beautiful career and you've done 25 different albums, which is absolutely incredible. So you've had a lot of different stuff come out.
Hmm.
And as artists, we all have inspiration, whether it be people or things that we hear. For you, what are some of those inspirations that you kind of found that you loved and wanted to figure out some way to incorporate into what you do?
Yeah. Well, obviously, there are many musicians that over the years that have inspired me to play. One of them is guitarist Pat Metheny. Other ones are jazz greats that influence a lot of people, like John Coltrane, the great saxophonist, Wes Montgomery, probably the original contemporary jazz guitarist. So those are certainly influences. And there's all kinds of classical composers that are very, particularly more recently, Debussy, Ravel, Beethoven. These are all people whose music I never stopped listening to. But in general, that whole question of inspiration is interesting to me because I don't really wait around for it. I don't think you do 25 albums of anything if you're waiting for something to tap you on the shoulder and inspire you. So I'm very much go into my studio and work like anybody works at a job. And there are days, especially at the beginning of a writing project, where I don't want anybody to hear what I've just been working on because I'm so unhappy with it. But what happens is, as I rub those two sticks together, so to speak, what happens is I begin to get warmed up and something begins to happen. And as long as I keep at that process, after a week or so, I've got a real momentum going. And a few weeks later, things are just new music is just coming out of me because I've kind of primed that pump. So the inspiration is one thing, but I don't think for anybody who's self-employed or, like a musician or an artist, I think that you really are your own inspiration. And it comes in the form of just doing the job like anybody does a job, whether they're inspired that day or not. Imagine if the person who does your taxes or the senator of your state felt like they had to be inspired to do a good job. You really wouldn't want them doing that,
No,
So it's important that consistency, I think, is important with the way that anybody approaches their work. They just go in and they do it every day, and that's how I try to lead my artistic life.
No, that's fantastic. I love that. Now, we all have stuff we like outside of our job. I get asked this a lot at Comic Cons, and I love getting to ask other creatives this because it's something that seems to be that kids don't really know. In the entertainment industry, it seems like we're not supposed to like anything outside of our job. Like,
Right.
we're only supposed to be absorbed in our job 24/7.
Right.
So, do you find that you have other hobbies and things you like outside of your job? And if so, what are some?
Well, I wish I could had some incredible hobby to mention now. I don't. I like to read.
That's a good one.
It is. I read. I certainly read. We fortunate enough to live in an area of the country where I can get a really good newspaper, the Washington Post, and so I read that every day. And I really read. There's nothing like newspapers because they give you stories that are way beyond what you get on television or even, for that matter, on the internet. And I love to really delve into a story that a good writer has written. So I do that, and I read all kinds of books, although primarily I read nonfiction. I just prefer, what I think of as hard reality to fiction, although I'm sure that plenty of people would argue with me about that. But I like to get outside every day. I like to at least walk once a day. It's a form of exercise, but it's also that is kind of a form of inspiration sometimes. Just to, especially these days when we're all kind of stuck inside a lot more than we're used to. Being outside is suddenly kind of a not an everyday thing, but kind of a pleasure now. Just to breathe the air. Now here, and I imagine where you are too, on the East Coast, it's been extremely hot these last few weeks. So, going outside now is a little different, but generally speaking, so, my wife has been on me for years that I need something, a real, as she would call it, hobby. Because I am definitely one of those people who is thinking about music and what I'm doing with it, both on the artistic side and the business side, pretty much 7 days a week. I had my 25th album came out in February, and actually went to #1 on some of the album charts in the country, which was really nice. But I've already written the next album. I've just been working away at it, partly because I have a little more time, but also just because I'm keeping that momentum going. So, I'm afraid at this point, I'm still a bit of a workaholic. Maybe that'll change, but so far not so much.
Well, that's not a bad thing. It's good though. And with the reading, that's always such a good thing too, because that is definitely a great hobby to pick up, because you can learn so much from reading.
Exactly. And it takes you sometimes way outside of your own existence, in terms of your experiences.
From so many different voices that way. And I love when somebody says that their hobby on here is reading, because that's such an important one, I feel.
I do too. And I'm glad that I at least have that. So
hey, it's a good one.
It is.
So along with that, besides having that pressure in the entertainment industry, another thing that we also end up feeling a lot of times is there's a spirit of competition that gets bred, whether it be for jobs, whether it be for the #1 spot. No matter what branch of the entertainment industry, we all feel like we're
competing
against somebody else. Do you find that it's easier to kind of be that way with other musicians, other composers, or do you find it's better to kind of create more of like a friendly, familiar atmosphere with them?
That's a really good question. And nobody's ever asked me that, which is interesting because I've been interviewed a lot and no one's ever asked that question. So good for you for thinking of that. I try not to be competitive. I mean, it gets the better of me sometimes. But after doing this for so many years, I'm fortunate to have a fan base that's more interested in what I'm doing rather than how well other people think it's doing, if that makes sense, So I try to do my thing, and it's pretty different in some ways from what a lot of what are called smooth jazz artists do. I do some of that type of music, but my albums, I did an album before this new one that's called Music for Guitar and Orchestra, and it was all my music for my guitar and a 60-piece orchestra. So that's not necessarily going to be a super popular record with the jazz audience, but my audience is interested because they're like on the journey with me. And so because of all that, I'm explaining all that because that helps to make me feel less competitive, because I'm not trying to compete against other people who are kind of going down the straight, narrow path with what they do. But there's no question, especially when I see like a new artist who's probably half my age nudge me out of the #1 spot, you do feel a little bit like, well, who are they? So, but on the other hand, I have this particular type of music. Unlike a lot of other genres, the artists tend to, for the vast majority, tend to be really nice people, and they are certainly competitive. You don't get to be really good at something by not having an ego. But the ego, if it's about competing, will make you do things that aren't true to your art, that aren't true to your heart. And at this point, I feel like it's much more important for me to be the best. Boy, this sounds like a cliche, but to be the best me that I can be, rather than trying to be better than and imitate somebody else or be affected. I definitely try not to be affected by what other people are doing. Although sometimes you love something so much you can't help but have it seep in, you know. I don't know with drawing and with art, if you have ever found yourself doing something and going, wait a minute, this looks a little too much like something I think I've seen. Because that can happen to me where I'm writing something and it sounds a little bit too much like something that I've heard.
I think with any form of art, really, because any form of acting or writing or music, it's all different forms of art. I think with anything, if we really like it, it subconsciously
Can't
comes
help
out
it.
because we're like, oh,
Yeah.
we really like this.
Right, exactly. I think the trick is to not to throw those things away, but to combine them with everything else in you and make your own unique stew, so to speak. I think that's the trick. And that's what I try to do. I try not to censor myself, but rather find ways to incorporate things good influences, you know, things that I really like.
I had an art mentor once when I was first starting out, and his thing he always told me was, if you see something you like from another artist, find a way to just, incorporate that. And that's how you
Wow.
style all your own. You just kind of like blend in the things together
Right.
that you like from somebody else's work with your own, and then it'll come even better.
Wow, what great advice for a teacher to give, because sometimes, sometimes they're the opposite. It's like, well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. That's my instinct too.
I always tend to find that it helps you improve, especially if you appreciate how somebody else did something, because you can also learn
Right.
a lot of
Yeah. when you're imitating the best, you've really set the bar pretty high.
definitely. And in the industry as well, we also get a lot of rejections, especially with competition, because with any job, you're going to have to go up against other people who have equally as good, if not better, skill sets. Do you think that's something that kids should take personally, or is that more of something that they can use as a learning experience for the future?
They can't take it personally, because anything that stops you from pursuing your art, that is the worst thing that can happen, in my opinion. If you have a vision and you have a burning desire to do something, no matter where your skill sets are at that time, you just got to take from that. And everybody I know, and I've been mentoring a relatively, I say relatively because he's 33, he's not that young, but he's young compared to me. I've been mentoring him. He's a really talented saxophonist who's also a meteorologist. That's what he does for a living. But he's a fantastic saxophonist. He's working two jobs basically,
Incredible.
one of them the art and one of them the day job. But I have never seen anybody apply what we're talking about so well. I don't know what you'd have to do to get him to take something to heart that way. He really just looks at it, whenever these defeats happen, he just looks at it like, okay, why did it happen? And what can I learn from it? And now I'm going to apply that to the next thing. And speaking of inspiration, that's an inspiration to me, because it's definitely, we're all very susceptible to, like you said, those rejections that inevitably happen. The first time that I got a mediocre review of an album of mine, it was just like, I thought, should I be changing everything that I'm doing? Am I, and of course, luckily I understood that where that writer was coming from and why they were critical. And really I had no choice but to keep doing what I was doing. It's not like, I don't think anybody's that good that they can be somebody else. You really have, what always works with losing out to somebody, whether it's an audition, which used to happen to me sometimes when I lived and worked in Los Angeles, before I started my own recording career, and invariably if you're out doing things, you're gonna have rejection. It just happens. But now the rejection can feel even more personal, because this is this music that I deeply cared about and slaved over for usually more than a year. You hear a finished album of mine, you're hearing the culmination of a year of round-the-clock work. But the longer you do it, the less the rejections matter to you, because you're piling up way more good reviews and people writing you emails that'll almost make you cry because of what your music is, how that's positively affecting somebody. So, but yeah, just learn from it. That's the best advice I can give. But whatever you do, don't give up.
I love that. That's something I always love getting to talk about because I think that's something, especially in this day and age with social media,
Yeah,
there's so many criticisms, there's so many rejections that can
and it's so easy for somebody to do it.
yeah, it's so easy to take it as it's a personal attack at you, but also learning how to deal with it properly and learning that it's not at you, just something maybe you can learn from in the future is always a great thing.
Absolutely. Or don't learn, or in some cases like social media, look at the source and make sure you understand where they're coming from. That bad review I got, the first, or really wasn't bad, but it wasn't great, which that made me not like it. When I realized that the writer was what's called a straight ahead jazz critic, in other words, traditional jazz. Well, no wonder he didn't care for what I did. He wanted me to do something that he wanted me to do. He didn't even hear, I don't think, what I was doing. So it's important to consider the source, especially when it comes to social media. Why are people doing what they're doing? Why are they saying what they're saying? So sometimes don't just let it go. Just let it fall off your back because there's nothing to learn from it, except to develop more of a stiff upper lip when it comes to criticism. It comes with the territory, it just does. But I think it's especially hard because we love what we do and we take it, we don't do it from our brain only, we do it from our heart and from our soul. We dig really deep. And so rejection feels like a rejection of you as a complete person.
Yeah.
So you gotta take that put that in perspective, always.
Definitely. Now, with such an amazing career, I'm sure there's many things that you've learned over the years, different places you've been, things that you wish you would have known when you first started out, from traveling, from writing, from producing stuff. If you could pinpoint maybe one or two things that you wish you would have known when you started out, what do you wish you knew?
It's another good question. I have to think about that one. As somebody who's a self-starter and a self-taught at a lot of things, I think that I wish somebody earlier on, for example, before I moved to LA when I was in my late 20s, I wish somebody had said early on, instead of focusing on what you don't do as well as you would like, focus more on making what you do well great. So that would have been something. I tell young people that all the time now, because I think that's the thing nobody told me. I kind of made myself feel like I had to be better at everything that somebody else was better at on the guitar or composing than me. And LA kind of taught me, because in LA there is always somebody who's better than you at something. At least when I lived there in the 80s, I imagine it's still like that. There's always somebody, like I was a studio guitarist in LA, which meant that one day I'd be playing rock and roll on a jingle. The next day I'd be playing country music for a record. The next day I might be playing jazz for a Ford commercial. So I had to be all these different things. And so if I felt that I wasn't a good enough country guitar player, then I would really focus on that, which was a good work skill for that environment. But in LA, there's always going to be people that's all they do is play incredible country guitar. And so LA kind of taught me, from now on, I'm going to focus on what I do best, which is almost always what you love the most. There's a reason why we do something the best. It's because we really like doing it. The things that we don't do so well, it's probably because we're not totally comfortable doing them. In the world of guitar, there are people that we call them shredders. They play a million notes. They have a ton of technique. They are the ones who many times get a zillion views on YouTube because it's like a physical feat what they're doing. But that's not me. And even though I have a lot of technique, I don't choose to do that. And it took me a while to understand it's because I don't really like that. I like melody, and I like things that move me and things that I feel will move other people. And generally speaking, people who are technical whizzes at something, they interest other people who wish they were a technical whiz at that thing. But they're not actually moved beyond all the, awe and jealousy kind of, of that. Whereas when you move somebody and it comes from their heart, you've touched them in a way that way. I just think that's so much more powerful. And I don't think you can do that if you're not being true to, where that part of you. And so anyway, that would have been, that's one thing that comes to mind that I wish a teacher in music school would have said. Other than that, nothing is coming to mind that's as strong as that, as far as, something that would have been useful for me when I was in my 20s or even before.
No, that's great. I absolutely love that. And that's such an important thing to remember, because I think we all we see so many amazing people, and especially in the age of social media, it's easy to see somebody else and compare, because it's just how can I be this good because they're this good at it? But we can't always be good at everything.
Yeah, that's right. You can't. And if you do, you'll end up probably being okay at a lot of things rather than, really good at it. And when you're a studio guitarist in LA, being very good at a number of things, it is good. But when you're trying to be an artist and your own music and your own recordings and your own compositions, that isn't really good enough. You have to be great at something, and that doesn't mean technically great necessarily, although that helps. Obviously, you're an excellent artist technically, but how you use that skill in the end is all that the person looking at what you're doing really cares about. How do I feel when I look at Aaron's work? Not how do I feel that they impressed me. Being impressed lasts for a minute, and then the rest of it has to come in.
Definitely. Now, with being in quarantine, because we have all been inside for quite some time, we have learned probably a lot about how we work when in a different situation. So for you, how do you find it differs from maybe working in a studio to working at home?
Well, my studio is in my home, so in many ways for me, that's where I am right now. In many ways for me, this quarantine experience is not all that unusual. The only thing is, as I consider the musicians for the next album that I'm writing now, I have to consider, are they able to record themselves well at home? Fortunately, a lot of musicians are, and they've been working this way for a while. I just finished producing a song for a guitarist in Switzerland who hired me to produce and mix his song, and I haven't ever even talked to him. I've never seen him. I've never even talked to him on the phone. It's all being done that way. So people are pretty used to most musicians, at least professionals, having their own ability to record. But I have to consider that, because now I don't know when I'm going to be able to bring people into my studio, when I'll feel okay about it, and maybe it's just as important when they'll feel okay about it. So I have a couple songs that'll be on this new record where I'm going to have a horn section on them, and not to be gross about it, but that's a lot of spit flying around. And I don't really want that. And you can't do that with a face mask on. So it's possible. It's certainly possible to do it in my studio, but it could be what we're doing right now with Zoom could be a very good way to work, where they're in their home studio and I'm in mine, and I'm producing them from like this. There's no reason why that can't work. And then there's some musicians I've worked with so much, I completely trust them to follow my instructions. Then I give them more feedback, and we've worked that way for years already. My main keyboardist lives in Connecticut, and he hasn't come down to my studio in decades. But we work really well together, and we talk on the phone. We do everything we need to get the work done. But yeah, so for me, and the business hasn't been that different, because having my own record company and doing all my own marketing and promotion, it's all been something I've done, you know, in solitude for many years now. You know, the main difference for me is just more socially. You know, I like to go see movies. I like to go. We live near DC. I like to go down and take advantage of all the free museums. And now, you know, I'm just reluctant. You know, I don't take any unnecessary chances.
Definitely. I don't blame you at all. I'm very excited though because you're one of the very first people I've had on here that has their own record label, which is very exciting, which means you're in possession of mostly all your work, right?
That's right, and that is a huge thing that I'd like to share with your listeners and viewers, because you hear all the time from musicians how, oh, I got all these plays on Spotify, and I got a check for $1.19. And I'm here to tell you that's not true if you own your own music. I'm making a very good living without touring affecting me at all. I haven't done a lot of touring for years now because it's not something I love to do. I do it because it gets the music out there. But I like creating recordings. And this, as bad as this has been for so many people, it's been really bad for a lot of musicians because they're completely dependent on performance. And for me, it hasn't been bad. I don't want to say it's been good. It just hasn't affected anything. In some ways it's been good. My Spotify numbers went from a respectable 60,000 unique listeners a month before this new album came out, before COVID, to 130,000 unique listeners a month. And I will see real money from that. And so owning everything is because I have the record label. I own all the recordings, so I own all the sound recording rights. I own all the publishing because I write all the music and have my own publishing company. And so when I get paid by Spotify or iTunes or YouTube or any number of many places that I get paid by, Sound Exchange, they are paying me for everything because there's nobody else that gets part of that, my piece of the pie. So I really encourage people, whatever creative field they're in, if at all possible, retain ownership of both your creations and the actual, in my case, they're sound recordings. In your case, for example, it would be the actual physical artwork, or print, or canvas, however, whatever medium you're working in. I really, really encourage young people to learn about the business side of whatever it is they're doing, so that that's how come I could do an album called Music for Guitar and Orchestra. That's a very expensive undertaking, as you can probably imagine. The reason I could do that and have creative license is because I'm taking care of the business. It gives me the financial freedom to do that. And so, I don't mean to sound like I'm tooting my own horn. I really don't. It's more that I really want to encourage young people to do that, because I started the record company in 1990. And back then in 1990, a musician starting their own record company, especially a musician who at that time wasn't known outside of the LA studios, was like, huh? Who does that? Why would you not want to go to a record company? That's how this is supposed to work. But it turns out that I just wanted creative control, frankly. I wasn't thinking money. I was thinking, I don't want anybody telling me that's not fast enough, or that's got too many notes, or that one needs another saxophone, or whatever silly suggestions that business types in the music business come up with. I didn't want that, but as it turns out, it was a very wise move from a business standpoint, which completely feeds the artistic choices that you have. If you feel like you've built up an audience and you have control of that music, whether it's on Spotify or whether people are buying cassette tapes like they were in 1990, it doesn't matter. You still own the sound recording rights and the composition rights. And in the end, that's going to yield income way past when that album or a piece of art came out.
Definitely. Along with that, though, because the other musicians I have talked to don't own their own record labels, so they don't know some of the process afterwards, after creating a song.
Right.
So for you, can you walk us through a little bit of what the process is of recording a song and marketing it and all that?
Sure. Well, I'll just use my latest album, Into the Light, as an example. It was the official release was the third Friday in February, but in December, after I had sent it off to the manufacturer, because we still do make CDs. The audience for what I do still will buy CDs because they think it sounds the best. So I don't make as many as I used to, as you can imagine, but we still make a few thousand, and they get bought. So after that was done, and I took a breather for maybe 3 days, I began shooting videos. I began planning my Facebook marketing campaign, both organically, the things you can do for free, and the paid stuff. And I spent weeks researching the best way to do an ad campaign using social media. I had never done that before, except for an ad here or there. This was a coordinated effort that went on for 9 weeks, and I made a chart of how all 9 weeks were going to go. And because there were different types of jazz on this album that appealed to people in many parts of the world, I had target regions of the world that I wanted to go after. I had target audiences for different pieces of music on the album, because some things would make one group of people buy the album, and some songs would make a whole different group of people be interested in the music. So there was that. Then I structured my radio promotion campaign. I did that all myself, as I have been doing for 20 years. I got all my radio contacts up to date. I prepared all of my mailings that were going to go out. I even had a cover done for the first single, because we give radio singles now. Even though it's kind of an album format, they want one song to focus on. And then come the beginning of February, I launched the first single to radio. And then when the album came out, I had already done all kinds of teaser ads. I'd already started to release videos. Of course, I have a national distributor who was handling one for the digital stuff and one for the CDs. Those distributors were, all given what they needed months ahead of time. So that once the album actually was officially released, then I went into, activation mode, where I began working all of these different things and creating all of these different ads for each of the 9 weeks at Facebook that I was going to advertise. And then it kind of went from there. As things come up, the record was very successful. And sometimes the more success, the more work you have to do. I tried to keep playing. The other thing I did was I said, well, people really seem hungry for something to do. And how can I help promote the record and also at the same time give people some relief from this crisis? And I started a series of 4 virtual concerts that I did on Facebook Live. And so I used those in conjunction with part of my marketing campaign to help publicize the album. And like I say, I was concerned because I have very high standards for how I like to present myself live. And as you know, Facebook Live, it is what it is, I mean, from both the sound and a visual perspective. But I was really happy to see that people were just happy to be able to watch and hear me play. And they were not looking to criticize. They were looking to say thank you for doing this. And so that, things come up sometimes that are just part of, when you do it yourself, that are just part of, you have to figure out how to be flexible and fold them in, I should say, to what it is that you've planned so carefully with the rest of your marketing campaign. But as hard as I worked on the record, I worked really hard on the marketing and the promotion, both beforehand and then in the implementation of it. But these are, not everybody loves doing this stuff. Although I'll tell you, Aaron, these days I'm getting a lot of calls from some pretty well-known musicians wanting to know what I'm doing. because they're suddenly caught flat-footed, not knowing how to do anything. So as regards social media, as regards radio promotion and all of those things. So there's always people you can pay to do these things. But again, that's how I maintained a lot of creative independence, is by not spending my money on things that I can do myself. Just not everybody, some people look at being an artist as it's somehow beneath them to get involved in the business side. And I feel like businesses, if done properly, is also creative. And if you do it right, there's a reward beyond the financial reward or the creative reward. There's a reward of just knowing that you did something really well and it worked. I can't tell you what it was like when my album went to #1 on one of the national radio charts. It was great as a musician, but it was also pretty cool as a business person to know that I made that happen with my promotional efforts. Radio has to want to play it. You can't make anybody do it, but if they don't know about it, or you're not properly educating them along the way, because it wasn't like everybody started playing the record right away. Some people wait around to see what other people are doing. So part of your job as a promoter is you have to keep them in the loop. And by the way, talk about having to turn the other cheek, as far as rejection. Even though the record did that, there was still a one key station that refused to play the song. And I don't know why. They would never respond to my emails. They would never, it probably has nothing to do with me. But, sometimes, even when things are going your way, we all have a tendency to look into the audience and pinpoint the one person who doesn't seem to be having a great time, and then focus on them. That's I'm guilty of that for sure. So that radio station kind of became that for me. I was like determined to get them, and they wouldn't even respond. I finally just had to give up. But you have to go along. You can't take a no reply or no action as a rejection. Sometimes that station can become your biggest supporter once they get on board. And that's what you have to remember, that they are people too. And they're getting a lot of phone calls and emails from all kinds of promoters and artists. And, but yeah, so that I think your question might have been better than my answer. I'm not sure I answered your question. Answer. Okay, good.
That's definitely a side of it that I think that you don't think about. So it's nice to hear like the people who are actually doing it. That's why I love getting to ask this question on the show when there's somebody who does something like that, because there's so many things that we don't see. Because when we hear a piece of music, when we see a piece of artwork, when we see a movie, it's so deceptively simple because it's right in front of our face.
If you did your job well, it looks easy.
Exactly. Think about all the work that goes in behind it, which was part of the idea of this show, is getting to know, like, there is a lot of work that goes into this. There is a lot of prep and everything that goes into it, and learning about that. So that way it becomes less of like taboo to talk about it and more like a thing where it's open, like, hey, let's do this. It's
absolutely. Yeah, no, it's what separates people out eventually. And it's why some people have a relatively short career and you go, what happened to them? Gee, they had such a big success. Well, sometimes it's because they weren't taking care of the business part of it. And the music world is full of people with successes and nothing to show for it. So, you really want to think long-term, in my opinion. And as an artist, it's almost your duty to do that because no one is going to do it for you.
No, I absolutely totally love that. So I got a couple more questions for you before I show you what I've been able to do. With what you've done, I think it's so interesting because it's not mainstream music. It's not like something you'd hear on a pop radio or you'd hear on the top 40 charts right now.
Right. No, you would not. Unfortunately, but no.
But that goes to be said that not all music has to be something that you're going to hear every day. How important do you think it is to keep kind of an artistic integrity when doing your work?
Oh, I think if you're not being true to yourself, the audience can tell that right away. I really believe that. They may not know anything about how you do it, but they know when you're speaking from a place that's special to you and important to you and is real to you. I guess you can fool some people, but I don't know how you do that. I'm not really capable of doing that because it takes too much work to do this. If you don't like it, to write something, record it, mix it, put it out there that you don't believe in. I compare it to a comedian telling a joke to an audience that they don't really believe is that great. The audience can smell that, they can sense it, that you don't really believe in that joke. And I think you get the response that you would expect when you try to pull something over on an audience. So I think it's important, and I think it's also important, a little different than your question, but it's worth pointing out. I happened to pick contemporary jazz, or what became known as smooth jazz, because it was a natural fit for me when it was first happening in the late 80s. It's changed a lot. Not necessarily all for the better either, but what my point is, I saw that I went to the newsstand, a newsstand in LA, and I pulled out what was then the trade magazine of music and radio, called Radio and Records, long defunct now. And now Billboard bought it. Or BDS, they're called now. And I looked at like the top, remember, this is the late 80s. So the top 40 chart is nothing but major labels. The country chart, nothing but major labels. The R&B charts, nothing but major labels. The contemporary jazz chart, major labels for sure, but all kinds of labels in the top 10 that I'm like, who's that? Never even heard of them. And so I recognized an opening that was there with because it was a music that most of the major labels, while they were interested in it, they weren't gonna try to dominate it. If I was a top 40 artist or a country artist at that time, mainstream, and I was trying to break through, I don't think I could have done it. I started my own label and done it. But in contemporary jazz, I could. So not only do I think you should be true to who you are and keep your artistic integrity always in the front of your mind, I also think it can work to your advantage, because you're now able to do things and get noticed specifically because what you're doing is not of interest to the big money players. So I don't know. I think that's important for young people to recognize too, that sometimes being special, if that's the right word for it, is to your advantage in the business world, because you can define your own terms, and if you're willing to work hard, you can sometimes with a machete make your own way through the forest. But it's possible, where I don't think I could have made my way through the forest if I was trying to compete with Whitney Houston and people like that, and that's who would have been really big in the late 80s. Just not going to happen. The world didn't work. Now it's different, but because people can go on YouTube, and if they've got something and they can get it out there, if it's good, it's good. But back then, you absolutely couldn't even consider that. Really, it just, at best, you would have maybe gotten the attention of a large label, and they would then come along and own all the rights and everything that I never had to give up.
Absolutely. Thank you. That is I love that answer, because I feel like that's such an important thing when it comes to any art, because art is an extension of you, whether it be music, your acting, actual physical art. It's an extension of how you're feeling or what you are as a person. So I think that's a really great answer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So last question for you. If a kid's watching this right now and they want to get into the music industry, or they want to get into the producing industry, anyway, whether it be in pop music, in jazz music,
whatever it is, yeah,
country, what would you tell them? What would be the one thing you want them to walk away from this knowing?
Well, I pinpoint exactly what your main thing you really want to do is. Not what you really think you could do, but what you really want to do, because that's what will keep you going when you get rejected. It's what will keep you going when money gets tight. It's what keeps you going when you're not inspired, naturally inspired. So find that thing that you say, I really want to do that. That's what makes me get up in the morning, and focus on that. Don't try to be the best guitar player, the best producer, the best composer. Try to pick one thing and do it really well. I certainly wrote music, but it wasn't until I started this record company when I was in my mid-30s that I really devoted myself to writing music. as a primary thing. Up to then, I was primarily trying to be the best guitarist I could be. And when I lived in LA, I was trying to be the best guitarist for everybody else. You know what I'm saying? So people would hire me in that very, very competitive world of studio work. So again, I would say, pick that thing that just is the thing that is what makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you think about, you imagine yourself accomplishing it. And then, and then you need to get, absolutely, you have to be at work all the time at it. And in that way, I can't say that I think people should have a lot of hobbies. I think that you really have to, in the world of, everybody wishes they were an artist. So in that world, whether it's music, graphics, acting, directing, produce, whatever it is, you have to decide, it is now my job to be the best at this. And once you instill that in yourself, it'll never go away. You will always hold yourself up to that. And when you get to be my age and your friends are all retiring, you're like, I'm not going to retire. What's that? I'm going to be doing what I'm doing now until I can't do it anymore. I don't understand having to figure out what to do next in my life. I know that's eons away for you and your generation, but trust me, I have a lot of friends who they're just at that point where they're very successful in their careers, but now they want to retire. But there's a problem. What do you do with all that time now? And people are figuring that out. And I'm watching some of my friends figuring that out. They love the first 6 months, but then what do you do? And the beauty of being an artist is that, and instilling that kind of a work ethic, is that your whole life is in front of you now. You know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. And unless something unexpected happens to you, and it can, absolutely, things can happen. We don't control everything. You're on a path that will be with you and sustain you for a long time, and keep you young. I'm very open about, the point in life that I'm at. But trust me, I don't feel like I'm that age. I feel like somebody who's, when we're done here today, I'll get back into one of the songs I'm working for the new album, because I'm really excited about it. It's what got me up in the morning and thinking about what I could, I need to write a new section for this. And even when I'm watching a movie now, I'll hear something in the background music and I'll go, "Ooh, that's interesting right there. I need to come back and just listen to that when this movie's over." It's what drives me. And so I think it's so great when people embrace the life of being an artist, because it has the potential of giving you something that will see you through your whole life in a very positive way, I think.
That is absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, thank you, Erin. I hope I didn't talk your ear off, talk too much.
No, that was perfect. I love that. The more information, I always feel like the longer that my guests talk and the more that they say, I find there's so many gems that kids can find just by listening to this. So thank you so much for sharing all that.
Thank you for what you're doing. I think it's so great you're sharing this with young people and thinking that way, because nobody was doing this when I was coming up. And
that was the thing. When I was growing up, I had Mr. Rogers, and he kind of went and looked and tried to find those little things like, hey, tell us about this. So there's not that today, and I feel like there's such an importance now, especially with being inside and everything, that kids can use a little bit of a pick-me-up and a way to learn. So it's definitely a fun way to do it.
Oh, yeah. Well, this has been fun for me, too.
Now comes my favorite time where I'm able to show you what I was able to do.
Oh, great. It's sort of like stealing a look here and there.
I'm hoping that the computer does not throw the image color off, because it does sometimes. So if it gets a little glare, just let me know and I'll try to. Oh,
that's great. No, it looks great.
Yay!
Wow. Wow, I can't believe you did that in such a short period of time.
I don't know what's going on. My brain just kind of blacks out and the adrenaline takes over.
I love it. And for me, I couldn't even begin to know how you did that.
I don't even know what happened. It just happened.
But from my perspective, that keeps me in touch with what people who listen to my music are many times like. You know what I mean? I react to something visual on just how does it hit me. I appreciate it to death, the art, the skill, because I have no skill at that. However, in the end, I as much as I try to learn how an artist does that, or how your eye sees things, because clearly my eye doesn't see things the same way that your eye does. But at the same time, it keeps me in touch with understanding that it's how it hits somebody. It's not really enough that you can physically do that, and I can't. But thank you for doing that. That's great. Is there a way that I can share that on social media or whatever?
Yeah, I'll have it sent over to you, and you can do whatever you like.
That'd be great. Thank you. So you're okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all those wonderful stories and information with us. And thank you so much again to everyone who tuned in. Again, I am your host and in-house artist, Erin Leffler. Catch you next time on The Drawing Board. I don't have one of those clicker things, so I just kind of use my hand, but like,
It works.
It just says like, hey, done.